Hey there! This video is going to be a full menu walkthrough and setup guide for the Canon R5 Mark II for shooting video. Now, I'm personally not much of a photographer, so I'm going to be focusing on the video side of this camera. So if you're looking for information about the photography aspects of this camera, this video is not going to be for you. I'm going to be focusing on video in this video. Now, the menu in the R5 II is very deep with a lot of options, but I'll do my best to cover as much as I can. I'm gonna go through the settings and let you know how I personally set up the camera and why I do that, and then help you set up your camera to get the best image possible. There's a lot of hidden stuff in this camera, and I'll do my best to cover as much as I can. I will be skipping over a few things that I either don't use or don't change. So if I don't talk about them, then leave them to their default settings. I do want to mention that this video is not sponsored whatsoever, and I purchased the Canon R5 II with my own money. So if you are someone that values independent and unbiased videos, deep dive reviews, and tutorials like this, please consider hitting subscribe. Also, there are affiliate links in the description for the R5 II and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. So if you're looking to pick up any gear, please go check out the affiliate links. They don't cost you anything extra, and they really help me personally and this channel. So I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, I do want to mention that I reset the camera before making this tutorial. I did have to change just a few settings so I could make the tutorial, but basically the camera is stock. So we're going to see exactly how the camera's set up, and we're going to go through the whole camera. So grab your R5 II and you can follow along with this. First of all, I want to mention that I am using firmware 1.0.2, which is the current firmware at the time of recording this. So if you're watching this in the future, just keep in mind, this is the firmware that was currently available when I was making this video. All right, first thing, we're going to turn our camera on. And we want to make sure we are in the video mode. So that's photo, that's video. And the next thing we want to make sure we are in manual exposure mode, because we're going to be shooting in manual mode to get the best possible image quality out of our camera. So if we press the mode button, we can toggle this over until we see the M, and we can select that. And on the back of the camera here, we can do the same thing. If we press that, we can scroll through here or just press it on there. But we want to choose M for manual exposure. All right, starting off with some basic navigation. This does have a really nice touchscreen, and you can access quite a bit just from the touchscreen. So you can touch the different exposure settings here. So shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. You can also get into the Q menu, which we're going to talk about quite a bit in this video. You can also press the Q button there to access that. We have the start and stop recording. We also have the way to change the white balance. You can toggle servo autofocus on and off, and you can also zoom in. So it's quite a bit of functionality that you get right off the bat, which is touching the screen. It's really intuitive and easy. You also have this info button here, which will toggle between the different information that's on the screen that you're viewing while you're shooting. And I'm going to talk about how to customize that as well. Other than that, there's not too many other surprises on the back. We have the playback button, the trash can, and the scroll wheel with the set button, which was pretty intuitive, and we'll work through that quite a bit. We have some other buttons we can customize we're going to talk about. So let's go to the menu here. There's a few ways to navigate this. I think the easiest way is to navigate between what I'm going to call the folders at the top. You can use this dial up here, and then there's the tabs that are located in there. You can see that's like the third tab of 6. The easiest way to do that is to use the dial up on the top here, and you can change that. But you can also use the scroll wheel, and you can also use the joystick. So I'll be using probably a combination of all of these to navigate the menus. So we'll start off at the very beginning. We're in camera and tab 1, see 1 of 10 over here. And this is probably the best place to start, not just because it's at the beginning, but some of the most important settings are in the first menu. So if we come under movie recording size, we have a lot of different options here. The first screen here, and actually the first tab, you can see there's 3 tabs going on, is really about the aspect ratio and the resolution. So you can just touch this, but I'm going to try to use the dials and stuff here so you can see what's going on the screen. So you have the option of shooting DCI, which is 17:9. There are a couple different options there. You can also shoot UHD, which is 16:9, a couple different options there. Now, what I personally shoot most of my stuff in is the 4K UHD fine mode. So I get 16:9, which is most common for my projects. Also, the fine mode. Now, most of you watching this know the fine mode is oversampled from the full sensor at 8.2K. So there's no line skipping going on. You get the highest quality image because you're going to get the most detail and sharpness, but it does generate the most heat, and so that causes the camera to overheat faster. Now, you do have the option of doing a non-fine mode, but this will give you less detail and sharpness and not as nice of an image. So I recommend 4K UHD fine for most situations. but you have the option to change that, like if the camera's overheating or whatever, you can change that here. Now, to go over to the other tabs, you can either touch it or you can see the little icon here. You can use this dial. So here you can change the frame rate. And most of you know watching this, so you can only use the 4K fine mode up to 30 frames per second. So you can see a lot of them are grayed out, but we're going to choose 30 frames per second. And then over here, we have the options for different codecs. For right now, we only have the long up codec, but this will change depending on some of the other settings. So I'm just going to hit OK. So I'm going to skip around a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to talk about here is going to be the movie cropping mode. Now, if you enable movie cropping mode, it will give you a 1.6 times crop, which is really handy in a lot of situations, specifically if you need more reach on your lens. So if you enable this, it will limit some of the different options in the camera. So one thing I want to point out here, which is kind of a weird quirk, is that when you go to movie cropping mode, you don't have the fine modes anymore. And I'm not really sure what's going on with this. I remember in the R5 Mark I, when you shot in the crop mode, it actually oversampled from, I believe, 5.1K. Now, I'm not sure here if it's oversampling from 5.1K, which is the crop section of the sensor, or if it's doing some line skipping thing. I'm not really sure. I haven't actually tested that. But I do want to mention that if you go into the movie cropping mode, you're in that mode there. And then when you go back out, it won't put you back in the fine mode. So make sure that you do that, or you set up a custom mode, which I'll show you later. This caught me off guard early on with this camera, and I was shooting some stuff and I wanted to punch in 1.6 times. When I punched back out, I didn't realize that I was not in the fine mode anymore. So you have to go back in here and change that back to fine mode. So just want to point that out. Next, we'll go in here and talk about the main recording formats. There are a few different options in here I recommend, but we'll start by talking about the RAW in case you do want to shoot RAW, which you can do internally in this camera up to 60 frames per second. So if we choose the RAW option, we come into the movie recording size. We're going to have different options in here depending on which recording format you're in. Now, there are two flavors of RAW in this camera. There is RAW and SRAW. RAW, as you can see, is 8192 by 4320. This is a full sensor readout. All pixels are stored on the camera. This is what I think of as RAW. Nowadays, some of these camera manufacturers are actually sort of manipulating the definition of RAW and making it something that I don't really understand anymore. And for example, Nikon does something very similar to this, but this is called SRAW. And SRAW was introduced in this camera, and I believe it's in the R1 as well. I have played around with this a little bit, and it is pretty good in terms of the image quality, and you do get the RAW controls and stuff like that. But you can see here that the resolution is 4096 by 2160. So it's storing a lot less data, and you can also see that in the data rate. See 740 megabits per second versus 2600 megabits per second, which is very, very large. Now, I was going to make a sort of deep dive video in SRAW and try to figure out what's going on with this. And before I did that, I actually reached out to my technical contact at Canon to get some more technical information about SRAW, and he couldn't give me any. So I don't know what's going on with this. I think they're holding it pretty tight and close to their chest and not letting people know the technical details because they're doing something that's probably unique to the Canon system. I don't know. But anyways, it's a cool format to start playing with. You can shoot in, like I said, RAW or SRAW, and then you do have different options here for RAW and RAW Light. So over here, you can see that if we switch to RAW Light, it'll go from 2600 to 1340 megabits per second, which is quite a big difference. And lastly, if we shoot in the SRAW, in RAW Light, we get 330 megabits per second, which is very, very reasonable in 24 frames per second. And lastly, you can shoot this up to 60 frames per second, which is pretty cool to be able to do that in RAW. Coming back out here, we have a couple other formats. I don't really recommend shooting in 420. So the two ones I want to talk about here are going to be the XF AVC-S and the XF HEVC-S, both are which are 422 10-bit. Now, XF AVC is the H.264 codec. Now, I've shot XF AVC in all the Canon cinema cameras for years. It's been my favorite format because it's very easy to edit. Image quality is great, all that sort of stuff. If you want to shoot in the XF HEVC-S, it's an H.265 codec. You're going to get a little bit more quality in the H.265 with a smaller file size, but it is a little bit harder on your computer to edit. So you do want to make sure you go through and decide what you want to do here. Most of the time, I'm still shooting in the XF AVC because that's what I'm used to, but I've also used the HEVC. Sorry, I'm getting confused with all the letters. And it is pretty good too. I haven't done a hardcore comparison between the two of them. Now, when you choose these, you do have slightly different options. When you have the AVC, you have options here for long op, long GOP. You also have all intra, and you have intra light, and you also have the high intra, which is a much larger data rate. But for example, the all intra is 360 megabits per second, and if you shoot long op, it's 150, which is very manageable. If you're wanting to know why you shoot intra, it's for when things are moving quickly or you have a lot of detail. It's also a little bit easier on your computer to edit. If you're trying to go for smaller file sizes, then go for long op. And like I said here, if you do use the XF HEVCS and you come in here, the only option you have is going to be long op. So play around with these and all that kind of stuff. I do also want to mention that if you are in the HEVC, you can actually shoot 8K DCI or 8K UHD. And if you come in here and do the XF AVC codec, the H.264 codec, you actually cannot record in 8K. So that is a kind of a big difference between the two. If you want to shoot in 8K but not RAW, shoot the HEVC, and if you want to shoot in the H.264 codec, you want to use the AVC codec. Next, we'll talk about the high frame rate options in this camera. Now, I don't like the way that Canon implements this in their mirrorless cameras. They do a great job in their cinema cameras with their S and F mode, or like Sony does in their S and Q mode, where you can change the recording frame rate, the base frame rate, and then change whatever you're setting the camera to. Blackmagic does this with their high frame rate mode. Red does this as well. I like that a lot better. This is kind of silly and kind of antiquated in my opinion, but I'll just show you how it works. So if you want to turn this on, what's going to happen here is that you're going to have two different options. You're going to have 4K in either UHD or DCI in 120 frames per second, and then you can also shoot this in 2K or 1080p up to 240 frames per second. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it automatically converts it to 30 frames per second, and there's nothing you can do about it. It just slows it down to 30 frames per second. So that's what you're going to get when you bring the file into your computer. You can't play it at full speed. It's already been slowed down and it doesn't record sound. Now, it's not the end of the world because you can just put 80% speed on 30 frames per second to get 24 frames per second, but I just don't like the cumbersomeness of this. I don't like the way it's implemented. So I generally don't do this. Also, you can come in here and record in XFAVC. You can record 4K 120 and it'll record at normal speed with sound, so you can do that. But I just want to show you what that looks like in this camera. And then the last thing on this menu is going to be the dual shooting mode, which you see is grayed out because I have C-Log 2 turned on. Now, I will show you how this works, but this is kind of a disappointment because this was one of the huge marketing things about this camera when it was announced, was that you can be recording video and capture stills, but it's pretty limited. So when I click on this, you can see that the custom picture is not set properly. So I'll just show you how this works, and we will talk about custom picture in a second. But I'm gonna come up here and turn this off so that I can come out here and show you this. So when you turn this on, basically what happens is you're locked into 1080p 30 frames per second long op in 4208-bit. You cannot shoot in log. And then the other thing to mention here is that you're only shooting in JPEG. So it's very, very limited. And so I really recommend that you don't have this on. If you want to try to grab stills from a movie clip, shoot in 8K. And if you're really trying to do this, one trick you can do is just increase your shutter speed a little bit while you're recording video, and then you can pull high resolution stills from that. That's an option, but I think this was a little bit gimmicky. I don't really like the way that was set up in here. Let me go back and turn the custom picture on. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, on to the second screen here. We have the sound options. So the first thing we want to mention here is obviously you want to turn the sound on if you're recording sound. The audio format we have is 2-channel versus 4-channel. So for most situations, I'm going to recommend 2 channels. Now for audio settings in here, we only have the built-in microphone because we don't have anything else plugged in. What I want to come in here is I want to change this to manual. I always like to use manual because I don't trust the auto gain control in these things. And also make sure you leave the wind filter turned off. I don't want this camera doing any audio processing. If I have to do that later, I'll do that in post, but generally I'm going to try to do that with a dead cat or something like that. The other thing you can do, you can use an external microphone or the hot shoe. So let me plug in a microphone here and show you what changes. So if you're looking for a good on-camera microphone that I've been using for a long time, I'd recommend this guy here. This is the Sennheiser MKE400. I'll leave this one linked down below. I've been using this one for a few years now and I really like it. So if we plug this in here, you can see on the back that the audio settings, now we'll have external microphone and we'll have settings for that. So like I said, let's change this to manual, and then we can go in here and manually change our audio. Now, the other neat thing here is if we do change this to 4-channel audio and we go to our audio status, we can see that we have a few different things going on here. We have the external mic left and right, and we also have the internal mic. And this is cool because it's a good scratch track and has a backup. So you can see this microphone lighting up here, and then if I tap the camera, you can see the internal mic going on here. You also have the display here for how you're monitoring, what you're monitoring. You're monitoring channel 1 and channel 2, and then the headphone volume here as well. So if you are using the hot shoe input, that's the Tascam unit, and you can pop that in the top, and then all the controls will be on the Tascam unit itself. So these are the basic settings for audio, but for most situations, I generally leave it on 2 channels, because if you leave it on 4 and then you bring it to your computer, you're gonna have 4 different channels of audio in there, which is fine, but you just have to make sure you're ready to work with that. Unless you need a backup scratch track, leave it 2, but if you want both, use 4. Next, we'll come over here and take a look at the exposure settings. Now, the first thing is the exposure compensation, and this is grayed out because we're shooting in manual mode. Like I said, to get the best image quality out of your camera, make sure you shoot in manual mode. But if you are using any of the auto exposure modes, you will have the ability to change the exposure compensation, but it's grayed out because we're in manual. Now, under the ISO speed settings, you can change the ISO, which is crazy because you do that from the main screen anyways, and we have a dial set to it. You can change the ISO speed range, so by default, it comes with a maximum of 25,600, which you can increase to 51,200 if you want, but whatever, that's fine for me. There are settings in here for the auto exposure for maximum ISO. Again, we're using manual mode. HF anti-flickering shooting is really cool. This allows you to really fine-tune the shutter speed so that you can get rid of things like banding and flickering from like LCD screens and fluorescent lights and stuff like that. This can come in really handy when you're just trying to tweak the shutter speed to try to get rid of some of that stuff. If we come in here and turn this on, we have the recommended shutter speed settings, so this will evaluate the scene and give you a best estimate. I usually just do this manual, but you can also let the camera try to figure that out for you. And manual settings, if we set this up, you can see that the shutter is now at 1 over 50.8, and if we change the shutter, it goes by very small increments. So you have the ability to really tweak the shutter speed with that to get rid of any banding or flickering. So I'm gonna turn this off. Next is the aperture 1/8 stop increments. And this is a neat feature, which I don't use very often, but you can see here, for example, if I'm at f4 and I change the aperture dial, it'll go up by 1/3 of a stops. So 4.5, 5, 5.6. So 5.6 is 1 stop above f4. So that was 3 clicks, or it goes by 1/3 of a stops. Now, if you come in here and you turn this to enabled, what'll happen here is that you see it says f5.6, and as I increase this, it's going to say f5.6 and 1/8, 2/8, and so on. So it will go up in terms of 1/8 increments. There it is at f8, and then it'll go up from 1/8 from there. So it allows you to really fine tune the exposure. And also, if you want to change the aperture and not have it like jump as much in between each one, you can set it to this, and it'll give you a little bit finer control, which is kind of nice. Auto slow shutter. We're not using auto exposure, and then detect priority auto exposure while using autofocus is on, but again, we're not using auto exposure, so that doesn't really matter here. Onto the 4th page here. This is really interesting. This is where we're going to get to our custom pictures. Now, this is interesting because this is a new implementation in the Canon mirrorless menu system. Custom picture was something that's from the Cinema operating system that they brought over. I do like this implementation because I'm used to it, but I think for a lot of mirrorless users, this is going to be kind of weird. So if you turn this off, then you will have basically the same controls you had before. You have your picture styles in here that you can use, and you can come in here and change all the settings that you're used to. If you want to access log and some of the other picture profiles, you can't do that by going in, and you used to be able to just change the log settings. There was like a whole menu for that. So the way you do that now is you come under custom picture. We're going to turn this on, and then there are different CP files, custom picture files. So if we come in here and select it, we have a couple different options here. We have Canon Log 2, which is what I recommend for most situations. Canon 709 is actually a pretty good like Rec 709 colored in look if you don't have a LUT or something like that and you want a baked in image. I do like the Canon 709 look. You can shoot in C-Log 3 if you're trying to match with other cameras. You also have PQ, HLQ, and BT709 standard. I don't like BT709 standard. I like these Canon 709 more. And you also have these user profiles, which I'll talk about in a second. So if we come in here and we select CP2, there are some options in here. And one thing you can do is you can edit these files. So when you come in here, this is C-Log2, like right out of the box. This is how they recommend using it. It's protected. So you can't come in here and change everything because it's protected, but you can unprotect it. And you can come in here and change things. Now, there are a lot of stuff in here that you can change. I usually don't recommend screwing with this stuff too much, but one thing is going to be the noise reduction. Now, noise reduction, there's a lot of different approaches to this, and I've made a few videos, one specifically about the R5C and the noise reduction settings I'd recommend, and I'll leave that video linked down below. Also, noise reduction settings in, I think it was the R6 Mark II, so it would be the stills menu. So I'll leave those videos linked down below. So if you want the ultimate control, turn noise reduction off and do your noise reduction in post. You can leave it on auto. It does a pretty good job. And there's some other settings in here. Like I said in that R5C video, I did have recommendations for spatial filter and frame correlation. I haven't tested specifically on this camera, so I'll just leave this as default for now. And I do want to mention that if you come in here and start screwing around and you want to reset it, you can do that. You just go to reset and then make sure you reset the C-Log2 profile to Canon Log 2. That way it'll put the right profile in there. So, and it automatically protects it, so you are good to go. Now, the next thing here is you can actually put in custom LUTs, and it's called a look file. So the way to do this is we're going to go in here and select, let's say, the first user CP file. There's like a whole bunch you can choose from in here, so you have plenty to customize. And when we select this, we can edit the file. And the one thing I want to recommend here is that, if you're going to add a LUT to this camera, which I'm going to show you how to do in 1 second. Now, LUTs expect a certain gamma and gamut, or gamma and color space. If you don't give them the right gamma and color space, the LUTs won't work properly. So the ones here are based on Canon Cinema Gamut and C-Log2, but if you're shooting on Sony, like if you're using like the Phantom LUTs, for example, they expect S-Log3 and S-Gamma 3.Cine. So if you give it something else, the LUTs aren't going to work properly. So what I'm going to do here is I want to make sure I change this to C-Log2 and Cinema Gamut, because the LUTs that you're probably going to be using are going to be based on shooting in C-Log2 or C-Log3, depending on the LUT that you're using, but I'm going to choose C-Log2. Now, this is the perfect opportunity for me to try to sell you a LUT, but I don't have any LUTs to sell you. So what I'm going to recommend is you go check out my buddy Tyler Edwards. He's got some cool Canon LUTs. I'll link down below for those, and maybe a coupon code if I can make that work for you guys. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to load one of his LUTs in here. I'm going to show you how to do that. So if we go in the look file setup, and we're going to load one of the LUTs onto the CF Express B card in the root directory and put it in the camera. There are some limitations. I think it can only be a 33-point LUT, and the length of the title can't be too long, and there's certain characters and stuff that you can't use. But anyways, we're going to register this in here, and this is the one LUT I brought in here. It's Tyler Edwards C-Log2 Direct 7 on neutral LUT. So that's the one I have on here, and when I click that, I'm going to conform to the custom picture profile, which we already set to be Cinema Gamut C-Log2. We're going to register this, and now we have it. So if we back out of here, we have the LUT in there, and it's all ready to go. We can actually rename this to whatever the LUT is or whatever. I do want to mention that it will show you here on the screen with the LUT, and it will bake it into the image. If you're shooting in RAW, it won't bake it in. So just make sure that if you have this in here, realize it's going to bake it into the image. It's not a view assist or viewing LUT. It actually bakes it into the profile that is recorded. So I just want to make sure that you remember that. All right, but I'm going to change this back to C-Log2 because that's how I'd like to use this camera. So there we go. And again, if you want access to this, you can just turn the CP off like I showed you before. All right, on to the next page here. We have white balance controls. This is where you can control the white balance. You can also do this from the main screen, so not a big deal. You have custom white balance here, which is still Canon's antiquated method, which I complain about every single time I make a video about these cameras. You have to actually switch it over to photo mode, take a picture of a gray card, come back into video mode, and then select that file to get the custom white balance. I really like how it's implemented in their cinema line and many of the other manufacturers, where you just hold up a gray card, you push a button, and it grabs the custom white balance. But you do have that option to do that in here. You have the ability to come in here and change the white balance manually between green and magenta and red and blue here. And then the next thing here is the lens aberration correction. Now for this, I recommend turning all of these on. And the reason for that is most mirrorless lenses nowadays rely on the in-body camera corrections to fix anything that's going on inside of the lens, and they're designed that way. So this lens is pretty good on its own, but I really recommend that if you're using like a Canon RF lens on a Canon body, you make sure you turn all of these on so that you'll get the cleanest image. We have peripheral illumination correction, which is vignetting, distortion correction, chromatic aberration, and diffraction. I leave these all on to get the best image right in camera. Canon knows what's going on with the lens and it bakes that in. I have no problem with that. The last thing here, which is off, is focus breathing correction. This is a way that it punches in a little bit and then it eliminates focus breathing on certain lenses. Really cool thing. I generally leave this off because a lot of these lenses don't have a ton of focus breathing and it doesn't really bother me so much. And I'd rather not crop in anymore. So, but you can use that if you'd like. That is an option there, and a lot of people do like that. Next is the high ISO speed noise reduction, which is grayed out because this has to do with shooting in custom picture. This is an option that is available when you're shooting with custom picture off. This is like the old menu system. But again, like I said before, the noise reduction settings are inside of the CP file, and I already showed you how to do that. All right, on to the 6th page here, we have pre-recording. Pre-recording is unbelievable. Basically, what you can do is you can select either 3 or 5 seconds. So it will record for 3 or 5 seconds before you actually press the record button. So if I turn this on and I come back out here, you'll see that the pre-record button says here pre-3. So this is great for shooting wildlife or sports or anything quick moving where you're camped out somewhere and when the bird takes off or when the baseball player does the thing or whatever, you just press the button and then it will record 3 or 5 seconds before you hit record, and so you won't miss the moment. It is amazing. I've used this for wildlife. It is absolutely incredible. What a cool feature to have. I'm really glad that it's in here. Next is time-lapse movie. Now, I love time lapses, but again, the implementation of this is kind of like the high frame rate mode. It's annoying and doesn't work great. So the first limitation here is you have to have the custom picture turned off. So you can't shoot in log when you're doing a time lapse. So I'm going to come in here and turn the CP off. Now we can do our time lapses. And a couple things I want to mention about this is that you, again, can't shoot in log, and this only gives you a file in 30 frames per second. So you can't set it to 24 or whatever. Again, more limitations. I don't understand why they don't fix this. That should be totally, you should be able to do that. You can change the intervals, the number of shots, and then you come in here for the different movie recording sizes. You can shoot in UHD, in intra light, intra, and intra high. And then if you come in here and you change this to the at HEVC, which is the H.265 codec, you can actually shoot an 8K time lapse. So that is pretty cool. But again, only 30 frames per second. Now, when you look at the exposure settings here, there's auto exposure for the fixed for the first frame, or you can have it do exposure every single frame. I generally do this in manual mode, so I set it and then that's it. But if you wanted to automatically expose every single frame separately, you can do that and set it to one of the auto exposure modes. You have screen off, which will turn the screen off after you get started if you enable that. And then you have the beep, which will beep every time a picture is taken. You can adjust that here. What's cool on the bottom here is that as you are selecting the interval and the number of shots, it will change the time of the movie. So this is how long the movie will run for and how long the file will be when you are done. So those are the different time-lapse features. I do use this on occasion, but like I said, it's really annoying to only spit out in 30 frames per second and only give you an option of not shooting log. On to the 7th page here. So movie self-timer is pretty self-explanatory. If you turn this on, it will set a timer for 2 seconds or 10 seconds before you want to record. So if I hit record, it'll count down and then start recording. So again, pretty self-explanatory. Let me turn that off. The next thing is the tally lamp. So with the tally lamp, there's this button, or sorry, this light up here that when you press record, it lights up. I love this. I think it's really great to see, but it can be distracting for your talent. If that bothers them, you can turn it off, or for whatever reason, if it's dark, you can turn that off here. Now for image stabilizer, this is a little, again, another one of my things that I complain about every time I make videos about Canon mirrorless cameras. This has really good image stabilization, a physical sensor shift IBIS system. Now, the issue here is that if you have a lens that has stabilization, you can either have lens stab and IBIS on, or lens stab off and IBIS off. There is no way to turn the IBIS off and still have the lens stabilization turned on. The way that you can control the lens and IBIS together is using the switch that is on the side. So if your lens has a stabilizer switch and you turn this on, it will turn the lens stab on and the IBIS. If you turn this off, it will turn the lens stab off and the IBIS off. And that's why when you're in the menu here, you can see that there's no way to control the image stabilizer because you do that with the switch. Now the digital IS is a digital stabilization which you can add on and it crops in. There's the on mode and the enhance mode. I use this on occasion, but not that often because I find that the lens stab and IBIS work really, really well. So I generally leave this off, and it also does crop in. The other reason I mentioned about not being able to control the lens stabilization and the body stabilization separately is I know some people have issues with the Canon stabilization on the really wide focal lengths. You get that sort of wobble, and a lot of people want to use the lens stabilization independently, but you can't do that. So I just want to let you know that that's how you control that in this camera. We have an auto level feature, which I've played around with a little bit. I believe this came out in the R7. I can't remember though. And if you enable this, what'll happen is as you're holding the camera, if you move it just a little bit, it'll automatically level it. I have played with this just a little bit. I tend to leave it off because I want to have more control personally over the camera, but it is there. Next is the customized quick controls. And this is the Q button like I was saying before. So if I back out of here and either press the Q button or Q on the screen or the Q button here, you have all these controls here. And we can come in here and we can customize that. So you can edit the layout. So you have up to 11 things on here. And if you have it all maxed out, you have to turn one of them off. One that I like to add in is the movie cropping. So I'm going to select that. And now we have 11 of 11 selected. So for us to add another one, we have to turn another one off. And then if you want to rearrange them, you can hit the info button here and want to select something. So let's say we want to move the 1.6, the movie cropping. Let's say we want to put that over here. You just move it around and you put it there and you're good. So you have a lot of different options here for setting the quick controls and also rearranging them. And we're going to save and exit. Besides that, in our custom quick controls, we can reset the settings or clear all items. Now, when we back out of here, the last part in tab number 7 is the metering timer. Now, the metering timer is going to be the little exposure meter that's on the bottom. So if you half press the shutter or if you start recording, you'll see that the exposure meter is on the bottom here. I recommend that you don't use this. I haven't used this in years. I recommend using the histogram or the waveform to get proper exposure or even false color. I made a few videos about exposure, both in the, for C-Log 3 in the mirrorless cameras and also using C-Log 3 in the R5C. So if you're curious about how to expose and grade C-Log footage in Canon cameras, I'll leave those videos linked down below. But like I said, when you half press, it'll show up. Now, I generally just set this to 30 seconds, so it's not, 30 minutes, so it doesn't turn on and off, but I don't even really use it, so I don't really care. But, if you do use that, change it to 30 minutes, it'll stay on longer, so you can see that while you are working. On to the 8th page, the first thing here is going to be metadata. Now, metadata is information that's added to a file so that when you pull into your computer, you can see more information about what was going on with the camera. Now, if you add news metadata, you can actually load a news ML file in here. I've never done this before, but if you need to do this, this is where this is at. And you can see whatever data you put in here after you load your file in there. And you can also clear the file. Now, the add CP file is interesting. Basically, this adds the custom picture file that we were talking about before onto your card. Now, the only thing I've seen this being useful for is if you pull up the clip in the Canon XF utility app, you can see which CP file you're using. I personally don't use that. I just pull up the file in Resolve or Final Cut Pro. So I don't see the point in that because I don't see that showing up in there. So unless you're using the Canon XF utility app and viewing your files in there, I would leave this off so that it doesn't actually record that CP file on the card and just add more files and take up space and all that kind of stuff. But if you're using the Canon XF utility app, it is cool. You can see that in there. Next thing is timecode. Now this camera does technically support timecode, but there's no way to jam sync timecode like a proper cinema camera. Now, you just got to keep that in mind. So I'm not going to go into that in too much depth here, but if you do need to use timecode in this camera, you can push timecode in through the 3.5mm jack and record that as an audio track using something like a Deity, I think it's the TC1 or the Tentacle Sync. So that's timecode's a whole other thing. If you do need to push proper, jam syncing timecode into a camera like this, then you need to get the R5C or one of the other cinema cameras. But it does technically have a timecode option here. Next is the View Assist. And you can set up the view assist for just the camera or over HDMI and vice versa. The view assist, in my opinion, works pretty well on this camera. I think it does give you a pretty nice image and allows you to see a more colored in image in terms of contrast and saturation, but doesn't bake it into the image, just a view assist. So it's really nice, especially if you are just looking on the back of the screen. One thing you could do is leave it on the back of the screen and then leave it off over HDMI. So if you're sending the signal out over HDMI, you can add a LUT in your monitor or something like that. But you have the option to turn them on and off separately here. Next thing is false color, and this is great that the camera has false color. I'm so happy to see that Canon is putting this in the mirrorless cameras, but the implementation of this is ridiculous. And the reason for that is when I press this, it says I can't use false color because I have the view assist turned on. Any other camera that has false color or a monitor or whatever, you can just toggle this on and off whenever you want. Even the R5C, if you have view assist turned on, you can turn false color on and off. And I actually have a button set up to do false color on the back of the camera, but here you can't. So what I did was I tried to look and see if you could, sign one of the custom buttons to turn view assist on and off, which you can't. You have to go in and turn it off in the menu, or you can turn it off in the quick menu or whatever, but it's still multiple steps to do that. So I'll just show you. If we come in here and we turn the view assist off, we can now turn our false color on. So that's really handy. But again, it's kind of silly to have to do that. We also have the false color index in here. So if you're unfamiliar with what all the different colors are, they are there for you to check out. Lastly, we do have the zebra settings, and we can set these to whatever you want. I generally don't use zebras for exposure. The only time I have used zebras is in cameras that don't have false color, and then I set the zebra to a certain level based on the log gamma. So that I can get the proper exposure on a gray card. And like I said, those videos I talked about this in exposing C-Log 3. I'll leave those linked down below. But for this camera, I would, if I was taking the time to properly expose a gray card, I would turn the view assist off and use false color and just use green on a gray card. But you do have the option for zebras here, but I generally don't use them in this camera. All right, on to the 9th screen here. There's a lot of fun stuff in this one. So going into the shooting info display, we have the screen info settings. And this is what happens when you toggle the info button. So like I showed you before, when you hit the info button, it toggles through all these different screens here. And this is where we can customize them. So coming in here, screen info settings, we can have it only show some of them. So if you only want to show like the first 3, you can toggle the 4th and the 5th off. So when you toggle between them, you only see those 3. You can also come in here and you can edit these. So edit info edit screen. If you press that, you can come in and turn different things off. For example, I probably want to have the histogram on my main display. So I'm going to turn that on and hit OK. You can do the same thing for the viewfinder. So again, you have 3 different screens that you toggle between when you hit the info button when you're looking through the viewfinder, and you can edit these or some of them as well. So that's in there. Next is the grid display, and you can add a 3x3, 6x4, or 3x3 and diagonal. So if you select this, you should see a grid on there, although it is pretty faint because I have a black background, but it is on there, well, because the cap's on there. So that's in there. Let me turn that back off. Next is the histogram display, and this is set to brightness, but we also have RGB, and we have it set to large. Let me show you how big the large is on this. You can see how big the histogram is. It's great, you can see it really well, but it takes up so much real estate. It's covering up so much of the screen. Unfortunately, I'm going to set this to small because it makes it more manageable. And if we can also, I leave it on brightness, but you can also set to RGB. I'll show you what that looks like. So you have an RGB histogram over there. I don't find that to be as helpful, so I'm going to set this to brightness and small. Those are the settings that I usually use. Now, the next cool thing they added to this camera, which is great, is the waveform. Waveform is a great way of using as a great exposure tool, and I use histogram and waveform in different situations. Now, if we turn the waveform on, you'll come back out, you'll see what the waveform looks like. So there's our waveform, and we're not seeing anything again because we have a cap on the lens here. And we do have the option for the waveform settings to also go from line to RGB. Let me show you what that looks like. So we have RGB, we have like a parade going on here. So that's pretty cool. But I generally leave this on line, but I'll just turn this off right now and use the histogram. The electronic level size is large. This is just the size of the level. So I will show you what this looks like. So if we toggle here till we get the level, that's the large setting. And we can come in here and change this to small if we want. So there's a lot of customization. You can see you have the small level going on there. Recording emphasis is cool. That is when you press record, it puts the little red box on the outside. It's a little bit easier to see that you are rolling. So that's a personal preference. I will leave that on for right now. We have aspect markers. This is really cool that you can do this here too. So for example, if you want to shoot like vertical 9:16, if we turn that on, you'll see you have that 9:16 crop. So when you're shooting and you know you're going to reframe it, you have that option there. Now in our lens info display, we have a couple options. We have focus display in manual focus mode. I actually don't like this, but what this does is when you are in manual focus mode, it will show you the distance. I find it to be just distracting and not very helpful, so I do disable this. I'm just gonna set this to feet because I'm in the United States, but I just disable that. The focal length, I love this. Make sure you leave that enabled. I think it's worth the real estate on the screen. You can see it says 34 millimeters there, and when I zoom, you know, you can see it changing the focal length there. I really like having that on there. And the last thing here is the SA variable amount. And this is grayed out because the lens I'm using doesn't have that. I think the only lens they have that has that SA control, I believe, is the 100 millimeter macro, but I've never used that lens before, but that's, you could turn that display on and off right there. So a lot of options here in the shooting info display. The quick control screen, like we talked about customizing it already. This is kind of weird, it's in a different section, but there's actually two quick control screens. So this is the one we've been looking at so far. There's actually a second one, which is really cool. So you can turn this on, it'll toggle between them, or you could just have the second one. It's really up to you. But let me show you how this works. So if we turn this on and we press the Q button, we get our first one. And we press Q again, we get our second one, which is cool because we get all these different options in here that are easy to access. We can turn movie cropping on and off here. We have the record options, so we can switch between how we're recording to cards, which we haven't covered yet in the menu, but you can do that here. You have high frame rate mode you can turn on and off, and then you also have the different recording modes. So without going into the menu, you can get them here, or you can access these in the Q menu if you want to set it up that way. There's a lot of options. And at the top, you have two different dots. So if we use the dial here, we get to the second one, and we can come in here and access this menu with all of our recording sizes, aspect ratios, codecs, and that sort of stuff. And then we also can turn our custom picture on and off here. So if you want to do that, and then you also have the ability to change the custom picture option like we were talking about before. So if you want to switch over to one of the other profiles, you can do that right here. There are so many different ways you can access all this information, and it's kind of like how you like to do it, but I just want to let you know that that second quick control screen is available there. Next, we have the viewfinder display format. I don't think I've ever changed this, but you do have the option of these two different things when you are looking through the viewfinder. Now, reverse display, I definitely leave that on, and that's really helpful when you are turning the screen towards you. It flips it around, and it makes it really easy to film yourself, so I would just leave that on automatic. All right, on to the 10th page of the camera settings. The first one is probably the most important setting in this camera, the auto power off temp. I already have it set to high, so it wouldn't overheat while I was making this video, but make sure you set this to high. This will allow the camera to run a lot longer. They do this as a protection so you don't burn your hand or whatever, but make sure you set this to high. The camera will run a lot longer. You can see it gives you the warning here. Standby low res. I actually turn this off, and basically when the camera is not rolling, it will lower the resolution on the screen to try to have less heat and stuff like that. I tend to just want to have the best possible image quality when I'm, looking at the image, setting things up, framing, that sort of stuff. It's definitely worth experimenting with to turn this on and try to let the camera run a little bit cooler. Next, we have the shutdown warning guidance, turning that on or off, and I'm glad they added this control in here, although I don't think it's even necessary in the first place. I think it was the Canon R6 Mark II when you flipped into 4K 60, it gave you a warning that it was going to overheat every single time. There wasn't a way to turn it off. Well, now you can turn that off. So for example, if we come over here and set this to 4K 120 and we back out, it gives you this warning about overheating, and it's kind of annoying that every single time you're going to see that. So if we come in here and we change this setting to off, now when we back out, we don't see that warning, although it does show up in yellow. So that is what that is there for, to turn that warning off. I can't believe they had to add that into the menu, but it's there. All right, next I want to talk about the HDMI out from this camera in terms of viewing, recording, RAW, all that kind of stuff. So in the camera here under HDMI display, we have two options. We have camera plus monitor and we have just monitor. So I'm going to select just monitor first to show you what's going on there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this to my OG Atomos Ninja V here. I don't even have a new one. This is the original one. This could be any monitor here for viewing sake, but let me plug it in here. This is monitor only. And like you'd expect, the back of the screen is blank. Even when I back out of the menu, it's blank here, and it sends everything over to this. So this is great if you are just using an external monitor and you're recording internally. You can leave the info on here, and if this is all blocked, if you have this rigged up or something like that. If you press the info button here, it will toggle through the stuff like normally. And so you can do that there. And lastly, you can get a clean output if you toggle through the info enough. But that's this option here. And then if we come in here, and the menu is obviously on here too because it's just monitor only. But if we go camera and monitor, we get a mixture of these two things. And when I back out of this, what's neat here is that I get the full menu and display and everything like that on the menus on the camera. And I get a clean feed out. So this is handy if you are like recording externally and you still want to see all the information on the screen. What is interesting though is if you press the menu button, it does kick the menu over to the LCD screen. So it is what it is. These are the options in here. And so I just want to show you what those look like. Next, we'll talk about the RAW options on this camera. So if I come over here to set the RAW to on, and then in the Atomos, I have to come in here and change the recording format from ProRes to ProRes RAW. It has to reboot the Ninja. And you can see it says not RAW here because it's expecting a RAW input. That's because I'm in the menu. When I back out of this, it's showing no input. So as of right now, I don't think this works. I went and updated my Atomos to the newest firmware, which at the time of recording this is 11.13.00. I actually looked in the notes in the last couple firmware updates for the Atomos, and I didn't see anything about the R5 II. The last one I saw had support for the R1 and the C80. So maybe it's coming soon. I know like when the R6 Mark II came out, it did not have RAW support right away with the Atomos, so we're probably waiting for that. Now, with this camera, I really don't recommend that you record RAW externally because it has internal RAW capabilities. The only reasons I would even think that you might want to record externally is if you specifically need ProRes RAW versus the Canon RAW, or you're trying to, lower the heat that's generated in the camera, let it run longer or something like that. But generally, like if a camera has internal RAW, I recommend shooting internal RAW. And lastly, you have the HDMI output range for C-Log. I would leave that to full. So we're done with the camera settings. Let's get over to autofocus. Now, autofocus could probably be a whole dedicated video. I'll give you the highlights here to get started. I'm not an advanced user with autofocus. I use basic autofocus features, and then I generally use manual focus a lot. I've personally been just using manual focus more, but I'll give you some starter tips here and show you how to set it up and those sorts of things. So Movie Servo autofocus is basically continuous autofocus. This is different from putting it in manual mode. So if we turn this to disable, then you have the ability to like use the AF on button and do single point focus and stuff like that. So generally, if you're using autofocus, I would recommend leaving that enabled. Next, we have the detect priority or detect only. So detect priority, it will look for the subject type that you selected in the area you selected, and it will look for other subjects if your desired subject isn't found. Now, detect only, it will only look for your desired subject in your area and will stop the autofocus if you can't find the subject. So for example, if you are shooting a person for an interview or something like that, you only want to focus on that person, you could set it to people, detect for subjects, and then just set it to detect only, and it won't be looking for other things. But if you're out doing general autofocus stuff, then maybe you want to use detect priority. So those are the options in there. The autofocus area, you have a lot of different options in here, and for different situations, I generally leave it on whole area autofocus when I'm using subject detection mode. And lastly, here is the focus mode, which this warning, I don't really make sense, doesn't make sense to me. Use lens switch to switch IS. That means image stabilization to me, unless I'm missing something here. But basically, if you want to turn the autofocus on or off with this lens, is the RF 15-35. There is a switch here to turn the autofocus on and off. This in here is for lenses that don't have the autofocus, manual focus switch. switch, you can turn it on and off right here. All right, on to page 2. We have the subject detection modes here. We have auto, which is fantastic. It will automatically try to look and find some of these different subjects. Auto is a great one to leave it in if you don't know what's going to be happening. We have people, animals, vehicles, and none if you want to be specific, or you can choose none and just have general autofocus, which is definitely handy in some situations. I generally leave it on auto, but if I am like doing wildlife or something like that, I'll probably leave it on animals because it's only going to be looking for animals. It might work a little bit better, but we can leave it on auto for now. For eye detection, we have a few different modes. We have disabled, so it doesn't look for an eye, it'll just look for a subject. We have auto, it'll choose left and right automatically. And then you can specifically choose right eye or left eye. I generally leave it on auto, and a lot of people wonder why you want right eye or left eye. One example I can think of is if you're doing like a side angle for an interview shot and it's a pretty shallow depth of field and you want just like the closer eye in focus, you could just like select left eye and it will keep that eye in focus rather than going back and forth between them. We can also register people, and this is a cool thing that got added to this camera, although it's been in Sony cameras for a long time. Basically, you can bring some images in here and it will register those people. So this is really handy if you're like, let's say shooting a wedding and you could register the bride and the groom and it will look for those people as a priority. I haven't actually played with this, but it is a really cool feature and it's cool to see Canon implementing it. But again, I haven't really tried this before. And then we have the switch track subjects. This will give you making it either more responsive or making it more locked on, switching between the tracking of the subjects. I leave it usually on standard just to, it works pretty well in there. But again, depending on the lens you're using and the environment you're in and how things quickly are moving, you can go ahead and play with this and your mileage may vary. Onto the third page here, we have the movie servo autofocus speed and tracking sensitivity. Lately, I've been having it on -4 and -2 because it does move pretty quickly. But if you're not sure what's going on, I would probably set it to 0 and 0 and then play with it from there. Like I said, it's going to depend a lot on what lens you're using and the type of situation that you are in. Onto the fourth page here, we have the lens drive when autofocus is impossible. I generally leave this on, but basically it's saying when it's having trouble locking on focus, will it keep trying to autofocus or will it give up at some point? Now, I don't really have this issue where it just keeps hunting and keeps hunting. And I looked in the manual and it said that really this is recommended when you're using telephoto lenses. You don't want the lens moving back and forth for a huge amount of time, and sometimes it can be severely out of focus and it can't find what it's looking for. So I'll just leave that on. Limit the autofocus areas. These are the autofocus areas we just saw. So if you want to deselect some of these so that when you go to the autofocus selection, you have less options. Same thing here with subject detect. Like if you know you're never going to shoot cars, for example, then when you go back to the subject detection modes, you can see that vehicles aren't even an option. So I just leave those on. I don't know. I don't know. If you want to be really quick and limiting your options, you can do that. And then same thing with left, right eye detection. You can turn some of the settings on and off so they don't show up in that menu. On to the last page of autofocus here, we have the manual focus peaking settings. I use peaking quite a bit when I'm using manual focus, so you can turn that on and off here. You can also, I think you can set it in the Q menu, but I also set a custom button to that on the camera. And then over here, you can set the level to high or low. I like high, and then for color, red, yellow, blue. I like red for most situations, but yellow and blue is an option depending on the environment that you're shooting in. Focus guide is a pretty neat feature, and I think I kind of want to make a whole video about this because I think it's really fascinating. Let me turn this on, and this is for manual focus, so I just turned the autofocus off. And when I come out of this, you can see that it has a box. Went vertical for a second there. It has a box and these little triangles, and this will do subject tracking, and so basically when you focus it, when you turn the focus, the two outside triangles will line up and the whole thing will turn green when it's in focus. You can do this with touch tracking. You can do this with subject detection. It's really cool. And one thing that's absolutely really cool about this is you can actually use this with certain manual focus lenses that have electronic contact. So even with a manual focus lens, certain manual focus lenses, you can do subject detection and then you can focus it, and when this lines up, it'll grab a subject, and then when this lines up, it'll be in focus. So it's really handy for interviews and stuff like that. So this is a pretty cool feature that I think is definitely worth playing with. And lastly, we have the lens electronic manual focus. Now, I just usually leave this disabled, but you do have a lot of options here, basically to allow it to use manual focus when you're in autofocus modes. You have it after one shot, which I think is mostly limited to photography, but there is one way that you can use auto shot with the shutter. And then you also have, some overrides here. Generally, I leave this on disabled, and then if I want to use manual focus, I'm generally using an RF lens. I'll just flip this over to manual focus and then turn the peaking on and go from there. That's how I use the camera, but there are options in here which I haven't really used before, but a lot of different ways that you can use sort of a hybrid manual focus, autofocus in the R5 II. Moving on, we have the playback and network settings. I don't change any of these. There are a lot of settings in there, but for me, I leave these as all default, and that's fine with me. Getting on to the next section here, we have the settings, also known as the wrench, which I think a lot of us call it. If you come into the record function and card folder selections, this has to do with how it records media to both the CF Express B card, and the second slot is the SD card. I have both of them in there. Basically, you can have separate cards for photo and video, so you could enable this, and then card 1 will be, as you can see here, video, and card 2 will be photo. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but I guess if you were handing off the cards or something like that. And you have different recording options here. So let's just talk about video. You could do the standard, which is just usual recording. You can have an auto switch card, which will go from card 1. When that's filled up, it'll go to card 2. Again, you'd have to make sure you're in a format and codec and bitrate that works on both cards, because SD cards are slower. You could also do the main recording to 1, a proxy to 2, or you record to multiple, which I really love. But like I said, certain codecs and stuff and frame rates and resolutions, whatever, may not work on the SD card, but that is an option here. But I'm just gonna leave it on standard for right now. And then you can have the record playback on 1 or 2 for these. I'm just gonna record both of them to card 1 so that it's not different. And you can also change the menu here if you want to rename the menu in which it puts the files into the camera. Backing out of here, we have the file numbering and clip number. I leave those both on continuous. The file name, we can change these if we want, but generally this is Canon, which is fine. I've changed this to like, CR 5 Mark II or something like that, so that, when you bring this in your computer, you will see exactly which file you're using. Make it a little quicker if I use this. So I changed it to Canon R5 Mark II, and that way when I bring the file in, it'll say CR5 Mark II, and then the file name and the index and all that kind of stuff. But you can change all this customization to however you want. This is where you can format the cards, so format 1 and 2. You can auto rotate. This is, I believe, is only for stills. So when you take a picture, if it is vertical, it'll show this vertical on the camera, or on the camera and the computer, or turn it off. Now this last one is auto rotate info for video, and I would enable this if you do any sort of vertical content. So I believe when you record this, it will bring it into when you bring it to the computer, it will show it vertically. Other than RAW won't do it. But also I just want to mention that if you do have this selected and you play it back in the camera, it will still show it horizontally. So I do like the option if it does flip it in the computer. So I would leave that on if you shoot any vertical video. All right, on to the second page here. We can set the date and time zone, basic stuff, language. System frequency is really important to talk about, because no matter what, everyone always asks me about this. This will depend on what region you're in or what sort of frame rates you want to shoot in. So I'm in the United States, so I'm going to shoot NTSC, which is 59.94 hertz. This will give me frame rates of 24, 30, 60, and 120. If you're in Europe or somewhere else that uses PAL, you want to set it to PAL, and you'll get frame rates of 25, 50, and 100. I always get the question, I can't see 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. It's because you're in PAL. Or you can't see 25 or 50. It's because you're in NTSC. So this is where you change it in the camera. I'm not going to change that. Next is the helped text size. This is kind of an obscure setting in here, but essentially this is how big the font is when you hit the info button. And I forgot to mention this earlier, so this is a good point to bring that up. If we go back to something here like one of the options here says info help. So if we hit that, it'll give you information. So if, for example, you want that text larger, then you could set this to standard. And then when I go back to there and I hit info, you'll see the text is larger. So anyways, that is a setting there. But I just want to mention that if sometimes you see that info there, you can get more information, get help on that if that is in the camera. You can also turn the beep on and off. I usually disable this because I don't like my camera making noise. But if you have this on, you can then change the volume there. Now the audio monitor, we have the ability to change the volume and change what we are monitoring. So if you're using 4-channel audio, you can choose different options here, or 2-channel audio. And then the playback monitor as well. So this is when you're in the playback, what you're listening to. So you have a lot of different options there, and this is where you can change the volume, although you can also do that, I believe, in the Q menu or set it up to do that there as well. Next on to page 3, and the first thing here is the screen brightness. I have this set at 3 right now for this tutorial, but generally if I'm outside, I have this thing cranked up all the way. One thing I do want to mention is that you have to be careful about the screen brightness, because if you're in an area that's kind of dark and you have the screen brightness cranked up all the way, the exposure will look too high. So just be conscious that if you're in a darker area, you might want to turn the screen brightness down, but if you're outside and you can't see it, crank it all the way up. This thing goes pretty bright. The viewfinder brightness, you can change this to auto or manual. Again, you have to look into this when you are doing that to change that, but I generally have that on a manual setting as well. The screen and viewfinder color tone, you can change that. You can make it a little bit warmer or a little bit cooler. I generally just leave it on standard. I think it's fine. You can also adjust the color of the viewfinder. And the screen viewfinder display is a way that you can make the switching between the LCD and the EVF change. Now I have it set to screen here for this tutorial, obviously. Now the first one is auto. Let me show you how this works. So when you put your eye up to the EVF, it will turn on the EVF. But the first one is when you have the screen out like this, then it will not do that. So if you have the screen out, for example, and you're shooting video, sometimes you'll be holding the camera like this. You don't want it to turn the EVF on. You want to leave it on that. So if you're doing this often, leave it on that first setting. But you can see if the screen is closed, it will work. Next is the Auto 2, and this is automatic switching no matter what. So if you have the screen out, it will still work, and you can change viewfinder or screen only. So I'm going to leave it on screen only for right now. The UI magnification, this allows, if you turn this on, you can actually double tap with both fingers, and then you can zoom in to see it better. I'm going to have that disabled. And the HDMI resolution, we have auto, or you can force it to 1080p or 1080i. I usually leave it on auto. If you're having an issue, you can definitely change it and force it into 1080 though. Onto the fourth page of the settings menu, we have shutter at shutdown. I love this feature. This is when you turn the camera off, the shutter closes and keeps dust off the sensor. I love that. You can have it either closed, which is what I like, or you can leave it open, but I like to leave it closed. Sensor cleaning, we have a few options. For auto cleaning, we can either have it at power off. You can have it do the cleaning when the camera turns off and when it turns on, or you can turn it off altogether. I leave it at power off. Essentially, this like shakes the sensor and tries to get any dust off of it. I think it's a good thing to have on there. I think that's how it comes as default. And you can also just you can just hit clean now if you want to. It'll try to shake the sensor clean, and then you can clean manually. And when you do this, you hit OK, it'll lock the sensor, and then you can go in there and physically clean it with a sensor swab. So those are different options for sensor cleaning. In terms of power saving, this is one of the settings I had to change before we got started here. I just disable all these in general because I don't like my camera shutting off. I'm pretty good about remembering to turn the camera off when I'm not using it. But if you have things that you know you're going to forget and walk away and you want the camera to shut off, you do have the option to set different power saving modes. But this stuff really just frustrates me, and I'm good about turning the camera off. So I just have those all disabled. All right, onto the fifth page here of the settings menu. We can reset the camera. We can reset individual settings. We can also do a factory reset, which is really handy. Like if you're selling your camera or you just put it in some weird mode and you need to reset it or whatever, you have that option to do that. Or you want to lend it to someone and give them a fresh start or whatever, you can factory reset it here. Next we have is the custom shooting modes. And this is really neat because there are 3 custom modes in the camera that you can toggle between, and you can set them up however you want. And so the way you access these is you press the mode button here like we did before to get into manual mode, and then we can choose custom 1, 2, or 3. And you can also do that with the dial up here. And also you can see that on the back of the camera here. So I'm going to select back to the manual mode here for the time being. And what you do here is you basically set up the camera however you want, and then you save that into one of the custom modes. For example, when I'm out doing wildlife, I will set the camera to 4K 60 with or animal detect autofocus, and I'll have the the aperture set at the highest one for the lens, which is 7.1. I have the RF 100 to 500, and I'll have the shutter at 1/125. All the details for exposure and codec and frame rate, all that stuff. You come in here and you hit register settings, and then when you set this to C1, it will be exactly how you have it. So make sure everything is set up properly in there. You can also clear the settings. And I do want to mention that if you are in one of those modes and you're changing like settings or exposure and you come out of it, it will default back to however you saved it. But if you come in here and you hit auto update and you enable this, when you're in one of those custom modes and you're changing stuff, it will automatically update that for you. This is personal preference. Generally, I just leave it set up the base however I have it. So when I flip back, I know exactly where I'm at every single time, but you have the option to do that. Or what you can do is if you have to make some changes, you could go in there and just update them this way, but I'm gonna leave this disabled for the time being. The other thing you can do is you can save and load your settings on a card. This is really handy for if you are giving your camera to someone else to use. You can save the settings onto a card and then load it back from the card. Or if you need to, before a firmware update, you want to be safe, or you're going to reset the camera, or the biggest thing for me is like if I lend it to someone and I get the camera back, I can just put my settings back in. Or if you have to set up multiple Canon R5 IIs, you can get one set up, save it to the card, and then take the card out, put in another camera, and load the settings onto there. So that's pretty cool. All right, on to the last page of the settings menu here. We have the battery info. There's some information in here. We have the copyright information. You can change the author's name and copyright details. We also have this where you can scan. It will actually open up the manual. So that's cool. If you don't want to go hunting around online, you can just scan that and you're good to go. We also have this certification logo display and then the firmware here. If you click on this, we have the firmware for the camera and lens. So you could load the firmware in on the CFX B card, and then you'd have the option to hit this and then update it. But this is where you can see which firmware you're on, even if you're not updating your camera. All right, next on to the customized controls menu. And this one, we're gonna start with the customize buttons for shooting. You can actually customize a lot of the buttons on the camera. There are quite a few buttons on here, which is nice. And you have separate decisions to make for photo and for video, but we're gonna talk about video. So I don't really change many buttons on this camera. The only ones I really like to change and to keep it consistent with my R5C is I usually like to make this button into false color and this button here into peaking. The problem, like I mentioned before, is you can't turn the false color on and off when you have view assist on, and you can't change one of the buttons to turn view assist on and off. So I'm just gonna change this button here to peaking. Now I do also wanna mention that there's a limited amount of things you can change buttons to in here, and not everything you are looking for is gonna be in here. So take a look around. There is like a limitation to what they allow you to use custom buttons for and what you can't. And some other manufacturers allow you to change more. Sony's really good about customizing buttons. And I also have to mention that if you're using some of their cheaper cameras, their lower end cameras, they have even more limitation to the different buttons that you can customize to. It's kind of weird, but it's true. So make sure you look around in here and figure out what you need, and you can customize quite a bit of the buttons. And this is, of course, how you want to use the camera, but that's kind of all that I wind up using. The shutter button function for movies, you can half press it. You have different options, the one-shot autofocus like I mentioned, or metering plus servo autofocus. Now the fully pressed, I absolutely changes to start and stop movie recording, and what that does is that when you are shooting, you can either start and stop recording with the red button here, but you can also start and stop recording with the shutter button. Now, I really like using the shutter button because it's very easy to find, and to me, I use that more than I take photos, so I make sure I enable that so you can use the shutter button to toggle trigger recording on and off. Customized control rings. Again, this is personal preference. I'll just let you know how I like to set this up. The front one I like to use for shutter. The back one up here I like to use for aperture. This one, the wheel in the back, I like to use for ISO, although sometimes I disable it because I bump it quite a bit. And then the control ring on the lenses, although a lot of the lenses I have are RF lenses that have control rings, I actually leave it off because I don't like the way it works, and I wind up bumping it and changing things. I don't need to change that frequently, but again, personal preference. There are a lot of different options in here, and you can come in here and change these to whatever you want. We also have some settings in here to change the direction of the different dials. I just leave these to default. And you can also switch the shutter and aperture when you're recording. I don't understand why you'd want to do this, but that is an option there. So when you hit record, it reverses the operation there. Now the multi-function lock, this is when you have the lock switch here and you turn that on, what will be locked and what won't be locked. So you have the option to customize that in here. All right, on to page 2, we have the touch and drag autofocus settings. I've used this a little bit, but basically if you turn this on, what'll happen is you can actually use the touch screen instead of the joystick when you're using the EVF, and it's pretty cool. So when you're doing this, you can either set it to relative or absolute. You can have it on the right side of the screen, the left, the top, and so on, or the whole panel. I generally leave it on the right side of the screen, and when you're holding this up to your eye, you can then use the back of the camera and just touch the screen to change the autofocus. It's pretty cool. It's kind of a thing. I think it started with the EOS R, if I remember correctly, but you can also use the joystick. So we'll just disable this for now. Now the autofocus area selection control with the MFN button. Now this, I already disabled that button that I showed you before, but let me just show you how it works anyways. If I come back here and I change this custom button to what it was, just if you're curious how all these things work in this camera. So you have the option when you press this autofocus area to use either the MFN button or the dial. So if we come out here and we press this, this is the whole area autofocus. We can now change this with the MFN button. The MFN button is right here next to what I had for shutter. So we can come in here, we can hit this, and then change the whole area autofocus by touching this. But like I said earlier, I'm going to control this in like the Q menu. So that's why disabling that is fine for me. You can also change this to use the main dial. So if I do that now and I press this button, then I can change it with this dial in the front instead of the MFN button. So kind of a niche thing there, but I just want to let you know what that was in case you're curious. We also have the sensitivity for auto point selection. That's when you're using the joystick, how sensitive it is. You can make it more or less sensitive to make it move slower or faster. So that's really personal preference. Focus ring rotation, I have this normal, but for example, if you are a Nikon shooter or whatever, and you're used to focusing the other direction, you can reverse it because these are focused by wire lenses. Now, this is a very crucial setting for manual focus. You can either have it rotation speed or degree. If you have it to speed, which is what it's default as, when you turn the focus ring faster, it will throw the focus further. So I don't like that. I like it to be rotation degree. So if you turn it, no matter what degree you turn it, it will turn the focus the same amount, no matter how quickly or slowly you turn it. So make sure you set that to linked to rotation degree. On to page 3, we have a few options in here. I don't change any of these. On to page 4 for touch control, you have the different options here, sensitive or disable. I do use touch control on occasion, but if you want to turn touch control off, you can do disable, and you could also make it more sensitive. And you can also clear all the customized controls here. Onto the various settings mode for pages 1, 2, and 3. I don't change any of these. But onto page 4, there is one that I want to make sure I turn on, and that is the release shutter without lens. Now, this is important if we're using a manual focus lens with electronic contacts. It may not start recording or take a photo or whatever if you don't have this turned on. So make sure you turn this on if you're going to be using lenses like that. And lastly, onto the My Menu page here. This is really cool. This is in a lot of different cameras. You can set up your own menus and add things to it. So if you want to add things to your menu tab, we're going to configure this and select an item to register. So for example, if I want to have white balance in here, I know it would be silly, but whatever, then you have white balance in here. So when you come back to your main menu, you can have all the different things set up in here. And if you go to the next page over, you can actually add another menu tab. So we can have 2 different My Menus. So now you can see at the top here, we have My Menu 1 and My Menu 2. And we can come in here and configure this. We can add things, sort them, delete them. We can rename it. I'm just going to delete this tab for right now. And then the other thing here is you can delete stuff, but the last thing is the menu display. So you can actually have the camera, when you press the menu button, just display to My Menu tab. So if I select this, no matter where I am in the menu, right? If I go out and come back in, it will bring me to the My Menu. So if you always want to go to My Menu, that's the option there. That's kind of an interesting move there, or you can display only from My Menu. But generally, I like normal display because wherever you were in the menu, and when you hit menu, it will go back to there. So that wraps up the menu, but there's a couple other things I want to talk about in the camera. So first of all, let's talk about the playback. Now, with playback, I know that most people know how to use this, but there was a couple of cool things I figured out about this recently I want to share with you. So you can play back the video clip, obviously, but if you press the info button, there's some more information that shows up. But press it again, and you get a whole bunch of information. So you see the clip here, you see the histogram at the beginning of the clip, which is really cool. And then you see a whole bunch of data in terms of exposure, the CP, the different, the codec, the resolution, and the bit rate, the length of the clip, the size of the file. And if we scroll down, we see even more information. We see XFAVCS, 4210-bit. We see the file name. We keep going down. We see the lens and the focal length we're at. We also see the RGB histogram here. We see the white balance that was recorded. We also see all this information in here. We see the different lens corrections that were used. And then going back to the beginning. If you press info again, you can see the news metadata, which we talked about before. So I thought this was pretty cool that this was in there. I didn't even know that was in there, so that's really nice. I did mention before, one of the big things about this is using the Q menu. So make sure you do spend your time to set this up properly, because that's the quickest way, in my opinion, to get into and out of a lot of settings in this camera and allow you to not have to dive into the menu nearly as much. So the last thing I really want to talk about here is this MFN button, which is pretty interesting. So let me show you how this works. So if we press the MFN button, this little thing pops up. And if you use the dial on the top there, which is showing you that icon, you can change the white balance. Now, if you see on the bottom there, it shows ISO 800, so you can change the ISO right there. And if you press the MFN button again, you'll get over here to the autofocus points. Or autofocus area. So again, it's just, there's so many different ways to access all the little things in this camera. You'll figure out what works for you, but I do want to show you as much as possible. Hopefully this gets you started and answers a whole bunch of questions for you. If you enjoyed this video, like I said, hit subscribe, please. It means a lot, and check out the affiliate links in the description below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.